So I'm delighted to be here with you this morning, and I'm looking forward to the possibility of having a informal conversation with you all a bit later. So as Alex said, I am Dena Plemmons. I'm the director of the Research Ethics Education Program at the University of California, Riverside. Though trained as an anthropologist, I've spent most of the last 15 years working in the area of responsible conduct of research, or RCR, or research ethics, or scientific integrity. These are terms that I use interchangeably, though I know a lot of people do not. Since general expectations for ethical research in science and engineering are often presented as a set of practices that are collectively known as the responsible conduct of research, or RCR, that's the term that I'll be using then throughout the rest of the presentation. And I'm assuming at least some of you have gone through some form of required RCR training. So a different possibility for RCR education is what I'll be talking about this morning. So in the now, I'm sure, familiar RT2 roadmap, taking a look at that, my presentation falls within a couple of domains, though most squarely within the ethical research domain, with data management as a particular topic, but much more broadly, this falls in the education and ecosystem arenas that Katie mentioned Monday as two of the three areas of focus of BITSS. So thinking specifically about that ecosystem arena defined by BITSS as the endeavor to, quote, change norms and institutionalize best practices, end quote. This morning, I want to talk about the IREDS research project. And as you'll see, IREDS stands for Institutional Reengineering of Ethical Discourse in STEM. And this was our attempt to institutionalize a best practice in RCR education. So before getting into the details of the project, I just quickly want to make some acknowledgements. So the project was funded by the Cultivating Cultures of Ethical STEM program at the National Science Foundation, and the graduate division at UCR also provided very generous support for this project. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the entire research team. So from the University of California at Riverside, Erica Baranski was a graduate student at the time, is now a postdoc. She was the one who did the actual intervention training with me. She was fabulous. Kevin Esterling, Juliette McMullen, David Lowe, Kyle Harp from Riverside, and Joe Childress, graduate dean emeritus from UCR. And then also from the Center for Open Science, Courtney Soderberg, Tim Arrington, and of course, Brian Nosek. So I wanted to thank all of them for making this research possible and successful. So there have been many and long-standing calls for to think more deeply about the relationship between practice, practitioners, and ethical awareness and behavior, and a general sense that addressing the ethical dimensions of practice might be most effective when that happens in the actual context where one practices. So our commitment to these ideas, informed by the theoretical orientation of deliberative communication, as well as the idea of situated learning or learning in practice, is what led to this project. So this idea of deliberative communication has, as an ideal form, reasoned, uncoerced, and transparent argumentation for and against decisions that are arrived at collectively. And as Englund has also noted, deliberative communication can be understood as an endeavor to ensure that each individual takes a stand by listening, deliberating, seeking arguments, and evaluating, while at the same time there is a collective effort to find values and norms on which everyone can agree. So I want to take a moment to focus on two specific aspects of these definitions this morning. First, the idea of transparent argumentation is an important one per se, and especially as we've been talking about transparency in our research throughout this week. So this transparency of reason, evaluation, and argumentation is essential for a group, a lab, a research group, any sort of collective project, to be on the same page, or at the very least to know where the pages are off and why and how. This effort towards transparency and that collective effort to find values and norms on which everyone can agree is the second aspect that I wanted to focus on. Understood and shared norms and values are essential to good science broadly and to the manifestation of specific practices in the production of science, for instance, data management and authorship. So at its most basic then, the goals of the IREDS training were to make discussions about ethical research practices within laboratories, within these research groups, a day-to-day part of research in science and engineering, and to make more clear that there is indeed a connection between ethical practice and good science. Most RCR training happens away from the lab or the research group. It's usually delivered online. It's sometimes delivered in classrooms. Sometimes it's a combination of both online and in classroom. And it's almost always designed as a simple transfer of knowledge. We wanted more. And we wanted to see lab members learn about the ethical dimensions of practice in the place where they practice and in the context of their specific research projects. And importantly, the sharing, the understanding, and the agreement happen of necessity communally. So IRIS was designed as a randomized control field trial among science and engineering labs, primarily at the University of California, Riverside, though we did include a few labs from Scripps Research. So the control condition of this RCT was whatever RCR training or education was normally available to the students, and the intervention condition was participation in a specialized curriculum, which was the IREDS training. So the intervention curriculum was integrated with a free web-based collaboration tool, the OSF Open Science Framework that's been developed by the Center for Open Science. Substantively in this project, we focused the training on 2 RCR topics, which were a really good fit with the OSF platform, and that's authorship attribution and data management. There was a training for each of the topics, and the training was scripted, and it alternated between questions and conversation points about the topic, and then demonstration of the OSF platform, which, as noted above, was pre-populated with information for every lab, so it was tailored in that way. So another aspect of the in-person training was that it was delivered using a peer-engaged, decentralized approach, wherein a grad student from each enrolled lab in the intervention condition worked with us first by selecting a project around which the training would be built and which we would pre-populate into the OSF platform, and then also helping to tailor and deliver that training. So both trainings included this combination of 3 elements, which is unique to RCR training, in that it was an in-person delivery. It involved a peer mentor, a training facilitator, and an incorporation of demonstration of the OSF platform. So we invited 458 labs, the lab being our unit of analysis. This was 34 labs enrolled total. That was 30 from Riverside and 4 from Scripps Research. This represented 184 individuals. 175 of those completed the pre-test, and 130 completed the post-test, and 119 completed both the pre and post-test. To ensure balance within departments, the randomization procedure that we used required that the first lab within a department was randomized to one arm, and then subsequent labs within the department were sequentially enrolled in the opposite arm from the previously enrolled lab. And a survey was our primary data source. So all enrolled labs completed a pre-survey, 2 midpoint surveys, and a post-survey. For the labs in the intervention condition, they got that post-survey 4.5 months following the last training, the second training. And for those in the control condition who received no training, the post-survey was administered 6 months after they completed the pre-survey. And here are just some basic demographics of the participants. So 53% identified as male, 2% self-identified as Black, 16% self-identified as Hispanic, 44% self-identified as white, and 9% self-identified as other. We had 32 PIs, 97 graduate students, 12 postdoctoral researchers, 23 undergraduate research assistants, 11 research scientists, 2 support staff, and 7 other. So as I mentioned earlier, the survey was the primary data source, and it contained 2 types of questions. The first type was direct measures of exposure to the important elements of the training and intervention, which again were authorship and data management. So we asked directly, does your lab have an established authorship plan governing the assignment and order of authors for manuscripts? We asked, does your lab have a data management policy? And since this training was done in person and it was face-to-face, and we were hopeful that discussions, those face-to-face discussions in this way would continue after the intervention. We asked, have you changed your views about ethical research practices based on discussion within your lab? And they're the response options that were given. Sorry, there we go. So some results. Because we used random assignment in the RCT, we could identify the causal effects of our training interventions relative to the control condition by comparing follow-up survey responses across the two conditions of the study. In addition, since we had access to participants' pre-survey responses to each item, we embedded the RCT in a side of a difference in differences design. So the difference in differences analyses test whether the difference between time 1 and time 2 is different for those in the training and control conditions. So in other words, it's an indication that the intervention impacted participants' responses from time 1 to time 2. We use Bayesian nonlinear regression models to estimate the treatment effect for these we did see significant treatment effect estimates for the item asking the respondent to report the presence of a lab authorship policy, and for the item asking if the respondent's views on ethics changed based on discussion in the lab. And as you can see, the null hypothesis of no treatment effect can't be rejected for the item asking the respondent to report the presence of a data management policy, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this pattern of results suggests that the training did have a direct impact on the participants regarding authorship policy and the effects of discussion on ethical practices. But it also suggests that it may be harder to change how labs manage data. We can't, of course, know why this is the case, but we suspect that most scientists likely already believe that they know best practices for handling data and that they are in fact engaged in those best practices for handling data. And so this did not have sort of the impact that we had thought that it might. And just a brief word here before I go on about the statistical analyses for the research project. I have just shared with you the limits of my knowledge here, but if you have any other questions, my colleague and co-author Kevin Esterling can answer anything. Just put those in the chat. And I can collect those from Alex and Katie and send them on to Kevin and make sure we get answers for you about those. So the second type of question on the survey was designed to create scales that measure latent concepts of interest. So conceptually, one can think of these survey items as indicators that help to measure an underlying or latent variable that is of conceptual interest, but that can't be measured directly. So this survey was designed with 6 different scales, and I'll run through the scales and some of the items in the scales pretty quickly here. So 3 of the scales measured what we were calling quality of lab communication. So one of the scales measured respondents' beliefs about the relevance of ethics discourse for their research and their own work. So how relevant to your area of work is learning about ethical research practices? Do you have discussions with members of other labs regarding ethical research practice, as well as seeking others in your lab to discuss ethical research practices? The second scale was about respectful discussions. And so this was meant to sort of assess the perception of whether or not folks felt heard, felt respected when they spoke, were able to sort of take in differing opinions. And the third scale was about lab disagreement. How often are there disagreements about research practices, and then specifically about authorship and data management? And then the second set of 3 scales was more tailored to the actual training content regarding authorship and data management. So we asked if the respondents understood the reason for having an authorship policy and the importance of having an authorship plan, and what the implications of a plan or the absence of a plan might be, and the same basic questions for a data management policy. And then we also asked about the preservation of replication materials and how important it was to the lab to archive records of earlier versions of manuscript drafts, for instance. And because replication can be an important aspect of data management, we considered these 3 to be part of the training content, basically.
Dena, before you move on to the next slide, we had a quick question from Shaon, who's asking how you selected the prize for the treatment effect analysis. If you could elaborate more on that.
I'm sorry, how we did what?
How you selected the priors for the treatment effect analysis.
Not a question I can answer, but I will be happy to send that on to Kevin and we can get that for you.
Awesome, thank you.
So here are the DID results for the 3 scales on top that measured communication and climate within labs. And then the final 3 scales here are the ones that measured the training content. So the individuals who participated in the training were statistically more likely to believe that ethics discourse was relevant to their scientific work, that discourse within their labs was respectful and open to diverse views, and that the climate for discussion in the labs was more constructive in the sense that disagreements over research were reduced. And these 3 scales indicate the labs who went through the training better approximated what we were hoping to achieve, which was deliberative communication ideals, in that discussion surrounding research and ethical practices was respectful, was open, diverse, was constructive, and that folks felt that they were able to give their reason and present their justification for practices and have that heard and responded to. And then the final DID results for the 3 scales that measured the substantive aspects of the training content. Those who participated in the training were more likely to understand the importance of and a rationale for both having an authorship policy and a data management policy, and reported that the lab was more likely to archive and preserve replication materials that underlie the research. So we think the results are fairly important in that the training met its goal of fostering a better climate and of demonstrating those deliberative communication ideals within the participating labs when compared with the control condition. And then another goal of the training was to see if there would be a lasting effect on the culture of ethics in that lab and an impact on the kind of discourse that was had in the lab. And we observed those detectable effects from the training 4.5 months after the intervention. There are, of course, some limitations. The results do only generalize to the kinds of labs that opt into the training, and we had very few labs opting in. It was on the Riverside campus, 1 in 10 labs decided to participate. And I think that just with my understanding of the labs who did participate, there's a self-selection bias in that several of them were already sort of very interested in some of these issues, or at least interested in issues of mentoring and good mentoring. And so we can't rule that out. We don't know also what would happen if we made this training compulsory and we were having to work with labs who were less interested in having this sort of conversation with their lab members. And we can't determine if the training would be retained as a kind of institutional memory within the lab. So we could only train the folks who were in the lab at the time of the training, and we don't know what processes there might be to sort of ensure that that training approach and the results, if any, authorship plan or data management plan were sort of shared with folks who came into the lab after the training.
And if I may interject with a question here,
yeah.
Laura was asking, were you expecting a higher take-up rate?
Yes, we were. We were very surprised. We had done a little bit of work before we sort of started recruiting in talking with folks beforehand just to gauge interest in this kind of training. I don't know how familiar you are with RCR training on campuses. It tends to be fairly anemic, and it tends to be primarily online modules. And so we were trying to assess interest if faculty would be interested in more sort of dynamic, interactive, engaged RCR training. And almost every single PI that we talked to was incredibly enthusiastic about that. And then when it came time to enroll them in the project, we didn't get the uptake that we wanted, and we were surprised. And I mentioned at the outset in the acknowledgements that the graduate division at UCR had also provided generous support. They provided $1,000 in graduate student travel funds for any lab who would enroll in the project. And I know that there were 2 labs specifically that were part of the project who enrolled simply because of that money, but the other labs were there because they really wanted to be. So yeah, there were a lot of things that made that sort of really low uptake quite surprising for us in some ways. So ongoing analyses. So we are still looking at some of the back-end analytics for the labs who continue to use the OSF after the intervention. And so that might give us some interesting insights as well. And there was a parallel ethnographic piece to the project, and that will be reported separately. And that will help provide some context for some of this quantitative data and give us a richer picture. We're also not in the analysis end of it, but also in the sort of the practice end. We have been doing, outside of, now that the research project is closed, we're able to do sort of this IREDS approach as an actual educational approach. And we have been doing that after the project closed. And interestingly, given the COVID situation, we have been doing that online. So we have no data about the effectiveness of the IREDS approach online. My colleagues and I are hoping to sort of write up a proposal to assess that. But anecdotally, it works just as well online in that we have, just the lab members are all participating equally and enthusiastically, and they report that the discussion was useful for them to be thinking about, for instance, data management. And in fact, we've added a second data management discussion. So the first one is a broad discussion about how they manage data in their labs and how they think about that conceptually. And then the second one is just to get them started to thinking about, if they wanted to write a data management plan, where would they start? Sort of what structure would they use? What format would they use? And how would they ensure that that was kept around for the longevity of the projects, basically. And so those have worked fairly well. And we have plans now to try this, interestingly, with in a humanities group, scholarship group. So we'll see how that works. So going forward, those are some things that we're hoping to do and sort of test the limits of the effectiveness of this in some interesting and hopefully useful ways. So we think it's important that one learn about the ethical dimensions to the practices of science, where one actually practices their science, and includes all who are involved in the creation of that knowledge. And the goal of this training was to make those kinds of discussions just a routine part of what one actually does day to day in their lab, in their research group, in their collaborative project. And so what I'd like to do now is have an informal discussion with you about authorship. I thought I'd switch things up and sort of not do a data management discussion, since it's been all data all the time with this training. And then you can perhaps get a bit of the flavor of what some of these conversations actually did sound like with the labs, a little bit of that. But before we move to that, are there any questions? Again, unfortunately, and I apologize, not about the statistics that I can answer, but anything else before we move into the discussion piece of this?